Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And of all the iconic superheroes born from comic books, TV shows, and movies, few are subject to as much deconstruction as Batman. And it's not just because he's one of the most popular and well-known characters of the past 100 years. Batman, as both a story and a concept, is fairly easy to scrutinize, for better or for worse. And most people, even those who don't follow the comics, know the basics of Batman's story. Bruce Wayne is the son of Thomas and Martha Wayne. They're obscenely rich and one of the most influential families in all of Gotham City. And then one night, after leaving a movie theater, a mugger guns Bruce's parents down right in front of him. While traumatized, this tragedy inspires Bruce to become Batman, and he takes it upon himself to wage a one-man crusade against the crime and corruption that has consumed his city. These are the fundamental elements of who Batman is. We've seen them play out in multiple movies, comics, cartoons, and video games. And over the years, they have been deconstructed in a number of ways. Since the mid-2000s, it even seems like Batman has been scrutinized more than most superheroes, and largely in a negative context. And a lot of it boils down to him being this wealthy billionaire, but choosing to be Batman rather than actually use his money to fix Gotham's problems. Now, that's more a criticism of billionaires than it is of Batman, but on some levels, you can't say it's entirely unreasonable. But other criticisms of Batman focus on his mentality. Ever since the Frank Miller era of the 1980s, Batman has been portrayed as someone who seems unstable and unhinged. And sure, a man who dresses in a bat costume and beats up criminals every night, that does seem unhinged. And some characters within his own story even point out how unhealthy this has to be for someone who suffered a severe trauma as a child. Now, I'm not among those who think such scrutiny takes away from Batman's appeal, but I'm also of the opinion that all of these criticisms completely miss what makes Batman so compelling as both a superhero and as a character. And I think the best way to illustrate this point is to turn to Batman the Animated Series, which, in my opinion, is still the gold standard for the character, the concept, and the narrative as a whole. I know I've stated in previous videos how much I love this show, and to this day, whenever someone wants to discuss Batman in any capacity, this is the show I still cite. Because I strongly believe that this version of Batman captures his larger complexities in a way that few other mediums have ever come close to matching. And while many episodes in this series explore those complexities, I'm going to single out one particular for this video, specifically Season 4, Episode 1, entitled The Terrible Trio. And I believe that this episode, more than most, offers a perfect counter to the notion that billionaire Bruce Wayne being Batman is somehow problematic. The premise of the episode has Batman facing off against a new group of masked criminals. And each member has a mask with a distinct style: a fox, a vulture, and a shark. The Gotham media calls them the Terrible Trio, and while Gotham has plenty of masked criminals, these guys prove to be more capable than most. We see them effectively breaking into an office building, busting open a safe, and stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. But they don't carry themselves as desperate, hardened criminals. Instead, they come off as smug jokesters, going so far as to taunt a security guard for his miserable salary. It seems like an odd tactic for a group of criminals, but odd tactics are what help them stand out, even in a place like Gotham. They even prove quite resourceful, going so far as to evade Batman by wounding Robin. And that immediately adds a personal element to the mix, which does come into play later on. And while these criminal conflicts are playing out for Batman, Bruce Wayne is still going through the motions of being a typical billionaire playboy, hosting charity events and rubbing elbows with other rich people. And among those people is a prototypical rich asshole named Warren Lawford. And whereas Bruce Wayne carries himself as someone who hasn't been corrupted by obscene wealth, Lawford is the exact opposite. He and his rich fraternity brothers, Armand Ledecker and Gunther Hardwick, basically see themselves as the alpha dogs of Gotham. And not just because they're rich. They really do think they're inherently better than everyone else in every conceivable way. They boast how they've used their wealth and privilege to live a life of adventure, going on safari, fishing for sharks, and basically doing everything you'd expect rich elitist snobs to do when they're not counting their money. But aside from them being unlikable pricks, they also stand in stark contrast to Bruce Wayne. Lawford especially comes off as the kind of guy you'd expect most billionaires to be. He's never suffered tragedy or trauma. He's never had to struggle or want for anything. And his only real concern seems to be seeking new challenges that most people can never afford or even attempt. In a sense, Warren Lawford is the kind of billionaire Bruce Wayne could have become. Spoiled by his privilege and wealth, squandering his time and money on useless, selfish distractions. That distinction is critical to how the events of the episode play out, and it's also critical in how it presents a direct response to a common criticism of Batman. Yes, he is a billionaire, and yes, he can do a lot of good with his money. Good that could benefit the city in more meaningful ways than beating up costumed criminals. But this episode makes clear that while Bruce Wayne does try to use his money for charitable causes, they're just not enough. No amount of charity or social programs could stop a group like the Terrible Trio from forming. And given the inadequacies of Gotham's justice system, and the justice system in general, it's very unlikely that they'll ever be held accountable. And that's where Batman comes in. That's why his crusade matters. And it matters in a way that goes beyond just helping Bruce Wayne deal with the trauma of his parents' death. Say what you will about the mental health of a man who dresses in a bat suit and beats up criminals, but can we at least agree that rich people being assholes is probably much more destructive? Warren Lawford and his buddies might not have the same perspective as Bruce Wayne, but these are men of great means. They could do plenty of great things with all their wealth and privilege, but they choose not to. By contrast, Bruce Wayne chooses to be Batman. And those choices matter a great deal, especially as the episode plays out. After we're introduced to Lawford's insufferable buddies, the trio attacks their next target, an older wealthy businessman named Sheldon Fallbrook. He also happens to be the father of Rebecca, a woman that Lawford is dating. This detail matters because this little heist does not go as planned. While the trio is robbing Fallbrook's apartment, Fallbrook himself shows up with a gun. The trio manage to fight their way out of it, but Fallbrook ends up getting seriously hurt in the process. They also have to evade Batman again, this time by ditching their loot. It's another questionable tactic among a gang of thieves, but it eventually does make sense for a very important reason. Later on, Lawford and his friends meet up with Rebecca, who is understandably upset at her father's condition. He does play the part of a supportive boyfriend, but that quickly changes when a diamond stick pin that her father owned falls out of his pocket. And the completely unsurprising truth is revealed. He, Ledecker, and Hardwick are the Terrible Trio. Now, this revelation is never framed as a surprise or an unexpected twist. As a show, Batman the Animated Series tends to be more transparent than most, even when it comes to the mystery detective elements of Batman. But this reveal still has an important effect, because it helps reveal why these three men were going on a crime spree despite already being rich. Warren Lawford says it himself. They were bored. That's right, the entire reason these men were breaking into buildings, stealing valuables, and incurring the ire of Batman was simple, generic boredom. It is far from your typical villain's motivation. It wasn't born out of tragedy, injustice, or even insanity. It was just boredom. It's the kind of motivation you rarely get outside of Batman's world. In a narrative full of so many colorful and eccentric villains, here he is facing a trio of thieves who just do what they do out of boredom. It's not just a strange yet remarkable reason for committing crimes, it further contrasts them with the choices and motivations of Bruce Wayne. Because remember, these three guys are billionaires too. They could do plenty of other things with their resources, but they chose this. Nobody, not Batman, not Gotham, and no circumstances of any kind influenced them. But now that Rebecca knows their secret, Lawford also realizes something distressing. The consequences of these choices are suddenly very real. For him, Ledecker, and Hardwick, this means Rebecca can't be allowed to live. They can't trust her to keep their secret. For a kids' show, that's pretty dark. However, this show never lets things get too brutal in that regard. Because by now, Batman has figured out who the Terrible Trio are through his usual detective work. And he arrives just in time to stop them from staging Rebecca's death as an accident. A solid fight and chase scene follow, but it never comes off as a major challenge for Batman. These three men might be plenty capable in their own right, but they are not the Joker, Two-Face, or Ra's al Ghul. They're just three rich assholes trying to escape the consequences of their actions. and he's the goddamn Batman. The outcome was never in question, but that doesn't make it any less satisfying. The episode ends with Lawford trying and failing to bribe Batman. He then boasts that he can buy his way out of the consequences of his actions. But in the last shot, we find out that he failed. Lawford still goes to jail. And in the final scene, we see just how distraught and distressed he is. From a spoiled, entitled rich kid to a prisoner. It really is a powerful moment, one in which the consequences of his choices finally sink in. Because that's really what it all comes back to, both for this episode and for Batman's story as a whole. Every member of the terrible trio had more opportunities than most. They could make choices that most people are never in a position to make. But they still chose a life of crime, deviance, and even attempted murder. Bruce Wayne had just as many opportunities, if not more so. But he ultimately chose to be Batman. And like the trio, that does come with consequences. This entire show, hell, the entire Batman mythos, shows what a burden this role can be. But Bruce Wayne accepts that burden. He doesn't hide from it, even when it affects him in profound ways. And unlike the terrible trio, Bruce Wayne's motivations are far more selfless in scope. He suffered such a monumental tragedy as a child, but he channeled the pain from that tragedy into being Batman, making it so others don't have to suffer like he did. It might still be a burden for him personally, but it ultimately relieves others of similar burdens. You could still say that it's not the healthiest recourse Bruce Wayne could have taken, but the end result, doing good for his city, imposing consequences on others who otherwise would not have faced any, that is an objective good no matter how you slice it. And for the terrible trio, every aspect of their motivations were inherently selfish. Beyond just being bored, they did what they did entirely for themselves, not caring in the slightest what or who it impacted. And being rich and well-connected, they did all of this with the assumption that they would never face any consequences. And in the grand scheme of things, that's entirely understandable. Billionaires facing consequences for their actions is probably the most unbelievable element of this episode. I would even argue that that sort of cynicism is more prevalent today than it was when this episode first aired in the mid-1990s. But that just makes the larger themes that this show and this episode conveys all the more impactful. These three deplorable men, regardless of what was motivating them, probably would have gotten away with everything they did were it not for Batman. We know this because in the real world, we're used to seeing rich people get away with egregious crimes. It happens so often that it doesn't even qualify as news anymore. The only way we can regularly see billionaires pay for their crimes is within things like superhero media. Batman the Animated Series gives us a simple, concise narrative about holding men like Warren Lawford accountable. As believable as it may or may not be, the substance of that narrative matters, because the substance of Batman's narrative still matters. It always has, going back to the earliest days of Detective Comics. Facing trauma, hardship, and even boredom is a challenge for many. Not everyone has the money, resources, or means to navigate those challenges in a way that works best for them. But Bruce Wayne, a man of almost unlimited means, ultimately chooses to be Batman. He chooses to be selfless in his crusade, bearing all the burdens and responsibilities that come with that. That is a choice that no other billionaire dares to make. You can even argue that it's impossible to be that selfless and a billionaire in the first place. But at the same time, that's exactly what makes Batman such an icon. He chooses what others cannot or will not choose. And delivering consequences upon those who make more selfish choices, well, that's just a nice bonus that we can all appreciate. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, take care and stay safe.